Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Steel. Dexter Coffey moved through the emergency room with the precision of a blade cutting through flesh. 23 years of trauma surgery had carved away every soft edge from his soul, leaving behind a man who viewed the world through the lens of damage assessment and calculated repair. His colleagues at Sacred Heart Medical Center respected his surgical prowess, but few truly knew the depths of his methodical nature, a trait that extended far beyond the operating table. At 47, Dexter commanded respect through competence rather than charm. His graying temples and steady hands told the story of countless lives saved and lost under his watch. He'd learned early that emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford when lives hung in the balance. This philosophy had served him well in surgery, but it had cost him his marriage to Loretta. Loretta Coffey, now Loretta Wolfe, had been his college sweetheart, a vibrant psychology major who'd been drawn to his intensity. For 12 years, they'd built what seemed like a solid life together. She'd supported him through medical school and residency, and he'd provided the stability she craved. Their son Mark had been the crown jewel of their union, a bright 10-year-old who inherited his father's analytical mind and his mother's warm spirit. The divorce 3 years ago had been swift and clinical, much like Dexter's surgical procedures. Loretta had met Zane Wolfe at the gym where she'd started working as a therapist. Zane was everything Dexter wasn't: spontaneous, physically imposing, and emotionally expressive. At 34, the former UFC middleweight had parlayed his fighting career into a successful chain of mixed martial arts academies across the state. What had cut deepest wasn't Loretta's infidelity. Dexter had seen it coming in the increasing distance between them. What had severed any possibility of forgiveness was her immediate remarriage to Zane and the casual way she'd moved Mark into their new life, as if their son was just another piece of furniture to be relocated. The custody arrangement gave Dexter every other weekend and alternating holidays. He'd accepted this with the same stoic determination he brought to removing cancerous tumors. Sometimes you had to cut away what you loved to save what mattered most. Mark remained his priority, the one person in the world for whom Dexter would sacrifice everything. Tonight, as he reviewed patient charts in his office, Dexter reflected on the man he'd become. Some called him cold. He preferred precise. Some saw his methodical approach to problems as obsessive. He knew it as thorough. These weren't flaws to him. They were tools, instruments as sharp and reliable as the scalpels he wielded. His phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Dad, can't wait for this weekend. Mom says maybe we can go to the Science Museum." Dexter smiled, one of the few genuine expressions he allowed himself. His son shared his love of understanding how things worked, of taking apart complex systems to see their inner mechanisms. As he prepared to leave for the night, Dexter considered how much Mark had grown. At 13 now, his son was developing the kind of logical thinking that made Dexter proud. Mark asked good questions, observed details others missed, and approached problems with methodical patience. In another life, Dexter might have guided him toward medicine. But given the boy's fascination with engineering and robotics, perhaps Mark would find his own path to precision. The irony wasn't lost on Dexter that his greatest strength, his ability to remain emotionally detached while solving complex problems, had cost him his marriage. But it was that same trait that made him one of the most sought-after trauma surgeons in the state. When other doctors lost their nerve in the face of massive trauma, Dexter found clarity. When others hesitated, he acted with decisive certainty. As he walked to his car through the hospital parking garage, Dexter reflected on a conversation he'd had with his mentor years ago. Dr. Raymond Leach had told him that the best surgeons were those who could switch off their humanity when necessary, who could see past the person to the problem that needed solving. At the time, Dexter had thought this was about medical procedures. He was beginning to understand that this philosophy extended to all of life's complications. Chapter 2. The Revelation. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Dexter was used to emergency calls. They were part of his life, but the paramedic's voice carried an unusual urgency. "Dr. Coffey, We're bringing in a 13-year-old male, multiple fractures. The guardian specifically requested you handle the case. Dexter was already reaching for his clothes. ETA, 6 minutes out. Doc, the guardian is Zane Wolfe. Says the kid is your son. The words hit Dexter like a physical blow, but his training kicked in immediately. Personal feelings had no place in trauma medicine. By the time he reached the ER, he was in full professional mode. His emotions locked away behind the same mental barriers he used when operating on mangled car accident victims. The ambulance doors opened, and Dexter's world tilted on its axis. Mark lay unconscious on the gurney, his left arm visibly deformed, his face pale and bruised. Zane Wolfe followed close behind, his massive frame filling the ambulance doorway. To any observer, Zane appeared appropriately concerned. Worried stepfather rushing to help his injured stepson. What happened? Dexter asked, his voice steady as he began his initial assessment. Kid fell down the stairs, Zane said, his tone carrying just the right note of parental anxiety. I heard this crash around midnight. Found him at the bottom of our staircase, barely conscious. Poor kid must have been sleepwalking. Dexter's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking Mark's vitals, assessing the damage. Multiple fractures in the left arm, possible concussion, extensive bruising along the ribcage. His son stirred slightly, mumbling incoherently. Mark, Dexter said softly. Can you hear me? You're safe now. Mark's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. For just a moment, when he saw his father, something flickered across his face. Not relief, but something closer to fear. His gaze darted quickly to Zane, then back to Dexter. Dad! Mark's voice was barely a whisper. I'm here. We're going to take care of you. As the nursing team prepared Mark for x-rays, Dexter pulled Zane aside. The MMA fighter towered over him by 6 inches and outweighed him by at least 60 pounds of muscle. But Dexter had spent years dealing with various types of intimidation, and size had never impressed him. Tell me exactly what you saw, Dexter said. Zane's story was consistent, too consistent. Mark had apparently fallen down 13 stairs, landing hard on his left side. The stepfather had found him quickly and called 911 immediately. Every detail sounded rehearsed, delivered with the kind of casual precision that came from repetition. 30 minutes later, Dexter stood in the imaging room, staring at Mark's x-rays with growing rage. But it wasn't the white-hot anger of impulse. It was the cold, calculating fury of a man who'd found a tumor that needed to be cut out completely. The fractures told a story that had nothing to do with falling downstairs. The breaks in Mark's arm showed clear signs of torque. Someone had twisted his arm with significant force. The rib fractures were localized in a pattern consistent with focused, blunt force trauma. These weren't the injuries of a tumbling fall. They were the injuries of systematic violence. Dr. Esther Myers, the radiologist on duty, joined him at the viewing screen. Dexter, these don't look like fall injuries. No, he agreed quietly. They don't. Are you going to? I'll handle it. Esther nodded and left him alone with the evidence. In any other situation, Dexter would already be on the phone with Child Protective Services and the police. The protocol was clear, the legal requirements straightforward. But as he stared at the x-rays, other thoughts crowded his mind. The legal system was slow, cumbersome, and uncertain. Even with clear evidence of abuse, there were no guarantees. Zane Wolfe was a respected businessman with resources and connections. Loretta would undoubtedly stand by her husband, perhaps even claim Mark was lying or confused. The case could drag on for months while his son remained in that house, subject to whatever punishment Zane might devise for triggering an investigation. Dexter thought about the pattern of the injuries, the careful placement that avoided areas that would be immediately visible. This wasn't the first time. This was practiced, methodical abuse designed to stay hidden. How long had Mark been suffering in silence? As he returned to Mark's bedside, his son was more alert but clearly in pain despite the medication. Zane had stepped out to call Loretta, leaving them momentarily alone. Mark, Dexter said gently, I need you to tell me what really happened. Mark's eyes darted toward the door, then back to his father. I fell down the stairs, Dad, just like Zane said. But Dexter had spent years reading the subtle signs of distress in patients who couldn't speak for themselves. Mark's body language, the way his breathing changed when he mentioned Zane's name, the almost imperceptible flinch when footsteps approached the room, it all painted a clear picture. When Zane returned with Loretta in tow, Dexter watched his ex-wife's performance. She was genuinely distraught about Mark's injuries, but there was something else in her demeanor, a subtle deference to Zane, a careful modulation of her responses when he was present. She'd become someone Dexter barely recognized, shaped by 3 years of living with a man who used violence as a tool of control. As he admitted Mark for observation and surgery to repair the fractures, Dexter made his decision. The legal system had protocols and procedures designed to protect children. But sometimes the system failed. Sometimes the only justice available was the kind you created yourself. Standing in the quiet of the surgical prep room, Dexter began to plan. He'd spent his career understanding how to dismantle complex problems, how to identify the precise point where intervention would be most effective. Now he would apply those same skills to a different kind of surgery, one that would remove the cancer threatening his son's life with the same ruthless precision he brought to saving lives. Some tumors required delicate treatment. Others needed to be cut out completely, ensuring they could never grow back. Chapter 3: The Architect of Revenge. 3 weeks after Mark's accident, Dexter had transformed his home study into a war room. To any casual observer, it looked like a dedicated father researching his son's medical care, medical journals, treatment protocols, specialist referrals. But hidden beneath the legitimate paperwork was something far more methodical, a comprehensive psychological and tactical profile of Zane Wolfe. Dexter had always believed that knowledge was the sharpest scalpel in any surgeon's toolkit. Understanding anatomy, physiology, and pathology allowed him to cut with precision rather than hope. Now he applied that same principle to understanding his enemy. Zane Wolfe, born Zachariah Patton Wolfe in Detroit, had climbed from the underground fighting circuits to professional MMA through a combination of natural talent and calculated brutality. His fighting style favored ground control and submission holds, techniques that required patience and methodical application of pressure until opponents surrendered. The parallel to what he was doing to Mark wasn't lost on Dexter. The MMA fighter's 3 academy locations generated substantial income. But Dexter's investigation revealed something more interesting. Zane's reputation in the fighting community was built as much on intimidation as skill. Former sparring partners spoke carefully about training sessions that crossed the line from intense to abusive. 2 former students had filed assault complaints that mysteriously disappeared before reaching court. More importantly, Dexter had identified Zane's pressure points. The man's ego was intrinsically tied to his reputation as an unbeatable fighter and successful businessman. His relationship with Loretta provided him with social legitimacy and respectability he'd never possessed before. And his academy empire was built on a carefully cultivated image of controlled strength and professional discipline. Dexter's plan would systematically destroy each pillar supporting Zane's life. The first phase required a delicate touch. During Mark's recovery visits, Dexter had observed the family dynamics with clinical precision. Loretta was genuinely unaware of the extent of Zane's violence toward Mark, but she'd been psychologically conditioned to accept his version of events without question. The fear she exhibited was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to read patient distress signals. Dexter's research into domestic abuse patterns had been educational. Controllers like Zane isolated their victims from support networks, made them financially dependent, and gradually eroded their confidence in their own perceptions. Loretta had been systematically cut off from her old friends. Her career had been redirected to support Zane's business interests, and she'd been convinced that her emotional reactions were inappropriate or excessive. The plan's elegance lay in its use of Zane's own methods against him. Where Zane used physical dominance and psychological manipulation, Dexter would use precision and misdirection. Where Zane operated through fear, Dexter would work through controlled revelation of truth. Phase 1 involved Mark's continued medical treatment. As the boy's physician, Dexter had legitimate reasons for regular contact and documentation of his recovery. Each visit allowed him to build a detailed record of Mark's psychological state, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about the Wolf household dynamics. Mark was intelligent enough to understand that his father was planning something, though Dexter never explicitly confirmed this. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his son's confidence and teaching him subtle methods of self-protection. Mark learned to document incidents, to create evidence trails, and to recognize the early warning signs of Zane's escalating anger. "Dad," Mark had asked during one visit, "why didn't you call the police when you saw my x-rays?" Dexter considered his answer carefully. His son deserved honesty, but not the complete truth, because sometimes the system doesn't move fast enough to protect the people we love. Sometimes we have to create our own solutions. Phase 2 would target Zane's professional reputation. Dexter had made contact with Orlando Acevedo, a former UFC fighter now working as a sports journalist. Orlando had been investigating allegations of training abuse in MMA academies across the state. With the right information and encouragement, his investigation could expand to include Zane's methods. Dexter had also identified Dr. Aubrey McKinney, a sports medicine physician who treated many of Zane's students. A few careful conversations about concerning injury patterns among Wolf Academy students might prompt a more thorough examination of training protocols. The most crucial element was timing. Dexter understood that rushing would create opportunities for Zane to adapt and defend. Like any surgical procedure, success depended on creating the right conditions before making the decisive cut. Phase 3 would be the end game. A carefully orchestrated confrontation that would force Zane into a position where his true nature would be exposed in a way that left no room for plausible denial or legal maneuvering. Dexter had identified the perfect setting. The charity exhibition match Zane was scheduled to headline next month, a high-profile event designed to showcase his academy's community involvement. As Dexter finalized his preparations, he reflected on how much he'd changed since Mark's hospitalization. The man who'd approached problems with clinical detachment had been replaced by something more focused, more purposeful. He wasn't driven by anger. Anger was inefficient and created mistakes. He was driven by the same clarity of purpose that guided him through complex surgeries. Some colleagues might call his planned actions extreme, even unethical. But Dexter had spent years watching the legal system fail vulnerable patients, had seen bureaucracy protect institutions while individuals suffered. Mark was his responsibility, and he would fulfill that responsibility with the same unwavering commitment he brought to saving lives. The difference was that this time, he wasn't trying to save a life. He was trying to destroy one. His phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Feeling better today, Dad. Thanks for everything." The message was followed by a photo of Mark working on a robotics project, his arms still in a cast, but his expression focused and determined. Dexter smiled as he looked at the image. His son was healing, growing stronger despite everything Zane had done to break him. That resilience would serve Mark well in the weeks ahead, because Dexter's plan would inevitably create chaos before it restored order. As he closed his files and prepared for bed, Dexter felt the familiar calm that preceded his most difficult surgeries. Everything was prepared, every variable accounted for, every possible complication considered. Tomorrow, he would begin the most important operation of his career, one where failure wasn't an option, and success would require the complete excision of Zane Wolf from their lives. Chapter 4. The Trap is Set. 6 weeks after Mark's hospitalization, Dexter stood in the crowded sports bar adjacent to Zane's flagship academy, watching his target hold court among a group of admirers. The Wolf Pack, as Zane's inner circle called themselves, represented everything Dexter despised about the MMA culture: manufactured toughness, performative masculinity, and the worship of violence as entertainment. Tonight, Dexter wasn't Dr. Coffey, respected trauma surgeon. He was David Mercer, Loretta's concerned cousin, who'd recently moved to town and was interested in martial arts training. The identity had been carefully constructed over the past month, complete with social media history and references from a gym in Denver, all meticulously fabricated. Zane Wolf. Dexter approached the group with calculated nervousness. "I'm David Mercer." My cousin Loretta said, you might have time to talk about training. Zane turned, his predator's instincts immediately assessing this potential new student. At first glance, David Mercer appeared to be exactly the type of client Zane preferred. Wealthy, middle-aged, and insecure about his masculinity. The expensive watch, designer workout clothes, and soft physique all painted the picture of a man desperate to buy the confidence he'd never earned. Loretta's cousin. Zane's voice boomed with practiced enthusiasm. She mentioned you might stop by. Looking to learn some real fighting skills. Well, I've been thinking about it since my divorce, Dexter said, allowing his voice to carry just the right note of masculine embarrassment. My ex-wife said I was too soft, too passive. I figured maybe it was time to, toughen up. The group exchanged knowing looks. This was familiar territory. Another soft executive looking to transform himself through proximity to violence. Zane's eyes gleamed with the anticipation of an easy mark. We get a lot of guys like you, Zane said, clapping a heavy hand on Dexter's shoulder. Successful in business, but never learned to stand up for themselves where it really matters. Don't worry, brother. We'll fix that. For the next hour, Dexter played his role perfectly. He asked naive questions about fighting techniques, expressed admiration for Zane's accomplishments, and gradually revealed details about his fictional divorce that painted him as both wealthy and emotionally vulnerable. Every word was calculated to appeal to Zane's ego while positioning himself as the ideal victim. The thing is, Dexter confided as the evening wound down, I don't just want to learn a fight. I want to understand the mindset. What separates winners from losers, Loretta always said you had this incredible mental toughness. Zane's chest visibly swelled. This was his favorite topic, the psychological dominance that made him superior to weaker men. It's about understanding power dynamics, David. Most people go through life as sheep, waiting for someone stronger to tell them what to do. But some of us are wolves. We take what we want and protect what's ours. That's exactly what I need to learn, Dexter said eagerly. When can I start? As they scheduled training sessions, Dexter carefully planted the seeds of his larger plan. He mentioned his substantial divorce settlement, his successful consulting business, and his search for investment opportunities. By the time they parted ways, Zane was already calculating how much money he could extract from this new student. Phase 1 was working perfectly. Over the following weeks, Dexter became a regular presence at the academy. His progress as a student was deliberately mediocre, good enough to avoid suspicion, poor enough to feed Zane's ego. More importantly, he established himself as a reliable source of validation and potential income. During this time, Dexter observed everything. He documented Zane's training methods, noting when intensity crossed into abuse. He identified which students were most vulnerable to Zane's psychological manipulation. He mapped the academy's financial structure, staff relationships, and operational vulnerabilities. Most crucially, he began to understand Zane's relationship with power. The MMA fighter wasn't just physically abusive. He was psychologically sophisticated in his methods of control. He identified each person's insecurities and exploited them systematically. With students, he alternated between praise and humiliation. With staff, he used financial dependence and job insecurity. With Loretta, he employed isolation and emotional manipulation. But Dexter also identified Zane's weaknesses. The man's ego required constant feeding. His sense of superiority depended on surrounding himself with people he could dominate. Most importantly, his carefully constructed public image was essential to his business success and social standing. During his third week of training, Dexter arranged to meet Orlando Acevedo for coffee. The sports journalist was exactly as Dexter had expected, intelligent, principled, and frustrated by the culture of silence that protected abusive trainers. I've been hearing stories about some of the MMA academies in this area, Dexter said carefully. As someone new to the sport, it's hard to know what's normal intensity and what crosses the line. Orlando leaned forward with interest. Which gym are you training at? Wolf Academy. Zane seems like a good coach, but some of the training methods seem intense. Zane Wolf, Orlando repeated thoughtfully. I've heard his name come up in some conversations. Nothing concrete, but there are whispers. You've seen questionable things. Dexter described several incidents he'd witnessed, all real, all documented, all carefully presented as the observations of a concerned novice rather than targeted accusations. Orlando took notes, his journalist instincts clearly engaged. Would you be willing to go on record if I decided to investigate? Orlando asked. I'd prefer to stay anonymous, Dexter said. I'm still training there, and I don't want to create problems. But if other people came forward, I understand. Thanks for bringing this to my attention. As Orlando left, Dexter smiled. The journalist would begin his investigation within days, driven by his own sense of professional duty rather than any external pressure. When the story eventually broke, it would be Orlando's initiative, not outside manipulation. Phase 2 was accelerating ahead of schedule. That evening, Dexter received a text from Mark. Had another session with the counselor today. Feeling stronger. Love you, Dad. The message was followed by a photo of Mark's latest engineering project, a robotic arm he designed to help people with mobility limitations. Looking at his son's creation, Dexter felt a surge of pride mixed with renewed determination. Mark was healing, but the threat remained. Every day his son spent in that house was another day at risk. The time for subtle manipulation was ending. It was time to move to Phase 3. Chapter 5. The Wolf Circle. 2 months into his infiltration of Zane's world, Dexter had become exactly what he'd pretended to be, a trusted member of the inner circle. His transformation from soft executive to dedicated student had been carefully calibrated to feed Zane's ego while positioning himself for the final phase of his plan. The charity exhibition match was 3 weeks away, and Zane's preparation had intensified to an almost manic level. The event would showcase the Wolf Academy's community involvement while raising money for local youth programs. A perfect opportunity for Zane to demonstrate his public persona as a positive role model and successful businessman. What Zane didn't know was that Dexter had been quietly orchestrating the conditions for his downfall. Orlando Acevedo's investigation had gained momentum, though he remained unaware of Dexter's true identity. The journalist had interviewed several former Wolf Academy students, and disturbing patterns were emerging. 2 independent sources had described training incidents that bordered on assault. A former instructor had corroborated claims about Zane's anger management issues and inappropriate relationships with female students. Dr. Aubrey McKinney had also begun asking questions about injury patterns among Zane's fighters. His inquiries to the State Athletic Commission about training protocols had triggered a preliminary review of the Academy's certification status. Nothing definitive yet, but pressure was building from multiple directions. The beauty of Dexter's approach was its inevitability. He wasn't fabricating evidence or making false accusations. He was simply ensuring that existing truths came to light through legitimate channels. Zane's behavior would ultimately destroy him. Dexter was merely accelerating the timeline. David, you've really come along, Zane said after a particularly intense training session. I'm thinking about offering you a partnership opportunity. This was the moment Dexter had been building toward. What kind of partnership? Expansion. I'm looking at opening a 4th location, but I need investors who understand the vision. Someone who gets what we're building here. Zane's eyes held the predatory gleam Dexter had learned to recognize. Your divorce settlement could be the seed money for something really big. Dexter feigned enthusiasm while mentally cataloging every word for future use. That sounds incredible. How much are we talking about? $300,000 initial investment, and you'd own 20% of the new location. But more than that, you'd be part of building something meaningful. Teaching discipline to kids who need it, showing men how to reclaim their strength. The irony wasn't lost on Dexter. Zane was literally trying to profit from his victim's fake divorce settlement while positioning himself as a mentor to vulnerable youth. The man's capacity for self-deception was almost impressive. I need to see the business plan, financial projections, that sort of thing, Dexter said. But I'm definitely interested. Over the following days, Zane became increasingly animated about the partnership possibility. He shared details about his expansion plans, his vision for the MMA Academy empire, and his philosophy about strength and dominance. Every conversation was recorded on the device Dexter had sewn into his gym bag. More importantly, Zane began treating Dexter as a confidant. The carefully maintained public persona started to crack, revealing glimpses of the man who terrorized Mark at home. The problem with most people, Zane explained during one late-night conversation, is they don't understand that respect has to be enforced. Take kids, for example. They'll walk all over you unless you establish clear consequences for disrespect. What do you mean? Dexter asked carefully. Like with Mark, Loretta's kid. Smart mouth, thinks he knows everything. Sometimes you have to remind them who's in charge, you know? A little physical correction never hurt anyone. Builds character. Dexter's hand tightened around his water bottle, but his voice remained steady. Absolutely. Kids today are too soft. Exactly. Loretta's always worried I'm being too hard on him, but that's women for you. They don't understand that boys need firm guidance. A few bumps and bruises teach respect better than 100 lectures. Each word was being preserved for posterity, but Dexter wanted more than just evidence of Zane's casual attitude toward child abuse. He wanted the man to reveal the full extent of his pathology. Mark seems like a good kid, though, Dexter probed. Bright, respectful when I've met him. Zane's expression darkened slightly. He's got potential, but he's got too much of his father in him. That analytical, overthinking bullshit. Sometimes I wonder if Dexter filled his head with ideas about being better than everyone else. His father's a doctor, right? Trauma surgeon. Thinks he's God's gift to humanity because he saves lives. Zane's voice carried unmistakable resentment. But when it came to keeping his wife happy, when it came to being a real man, he couldn't handle it. Loretta needed someone stronger. The psychological profile was becoming clearer. Zane's abuse of Mark wasn't just about control. It was about competing with Dexter through their son. Every act of violence was, in Zane's mind, a demonstration of his superiority over the boy's father. Must be satisfying, Dexter said, proving you're the better man. Every day, Zane agreed. And when Mark finally learns to respect strength over intelligence, he'll be better for it. That night, alone in his study, Dexter reviewed the recordings while finalizing preparations for the exhibition match. Everything was falling into place with surgical precision. Orlando's investigation would break 2 days before the event, creating maximum damage to Zane's reputation. Dr. McKinney's concerns about training injuries would reach the athletic commission the same week. The business partnership discussions had given Dexter detailed information about Zane's financial vulnerabilities and illegal tax strategies. But the centerpiece of his plan required one final element: Mark's testimony. His son had been attending regular counseling sessions since the accident, gradually building the confidence to speak about his experiences. The therapist, Dr. Megan McGuire, had documented a clear pattern of escalating abuse. With the right encouragement, Mark was ready to tell the truth publicly. The exhibition match would be the perfect forum. Hundreds of attendees, local media coverage, and Zane's entire social and professional network in attendance. When the carefully orchestrated revelations began, there would be no escape, no spin control, no way to contain the damage. As Dexter prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from Mark. Dad, I've been thinking about what we discussed. I'm ready to tell people what really happened. I want to help stop him. The pieces were all in position. In 3 weeks, at the height of his public triumph, Zane Wolfe would discover what it felt like to be systematically destroyed by someone who understood the true meaning of calculated precision. Dexter had spent months studying his target, identifying every weakness, every vulnerability, every pressure point. Now it was time to apply that knowledge with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to removing cancerous tissue. Some tumors could be treated with radiation or chemotherapy. But malignant growths like Zane Wolfe required complete surgical excision, and Dexter intended to cut deep enough to ensure the cancer never returned. Chapter 6: The Trap Springs. The Riverside Convention Center buzzed with anticipation on the night of Zane's charity exhibition match. Local dignitaries, business leaders, and MMA enthusiasts filled the arena, while cameras captured what was supposed to be Zane Wolfe's crowning moment. The respected businessman and community leader showcasing his athletic prowess for charity. Dexter arrived early, his David Mercer persona in place, but his surgeon's mind focused on the precision timing required for the evening's events. He'd positioned himself at a table near the VIP section, close enough to observe Zane's reactions, but far enough to avoid suspicion when everything unraveled. At 6:30 p.m., exactly as planned, Orlando Acevedo's article went live on the state's largest sports journalism website. The headline read, "Culture of Fear, Inside the Abuse Allegations at Elite MMA Academy." The piece detailed systematic patterns of training abuse, backed by interviews with former students and corroborated by medical records that Dr. McKinney had provided through official channels. Dexter watched as several attendees began checking their phones, their expressions shifting from anticipation to concern. Social media began amplifying the story, and the hashtag Wolf Academy Abuse started trending locally. At 7:15 p.m., as Zane completed his warm-up routine, his manager approached with visible agitation. The two men had an intense conversation in the corner of the warm-up area, Zane's body language becoming increasingly aggressive as he processed the implications of the breaking story. But this was only the beginning. At 7:45 p.m., as the opening ceremonies began, Dr. McKinney's formal complaint to the State Athletic Commission was leaked to local news outlets. The medical evidence of suspicious injury patterns among Wolf Academy students added credibility to Orlando's reporting, creating a second wave of damaging coverage. Zane entered the arena for the pre-fight introductions to notably subdued applause. Word of the allegations had spread through the crowd, and his usual confident swagger appeared forced. Loretta sat in the front row, her face pale with confusion and dawning horror as she realized the scope of the accusations against her husband. The exhibition match itself was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Zane's opponent, Rodrigo Boone, was a younger fighter who trained briefly at Wolf Academy before leaving due to what he'd privately described as concerning training methods. Rodrigo fought with unusual intensity, landing several clean strikes that clearly frustrated Zane. As the second round began, Dexter noticed Zane's technique beginning to deteriorate under pressure. The man who prided himself on controlled aggression was becoming sloppy, emotional, reactive. When Rodrigo landed a particularly hard combination, Zane retaliated with an illegal elbow strike that drew immediate intervention from the referee. The crowd's reaction was telling. Instead of the usual cheers for aggressive fighting, there were murmurs of disapproval. The allegations had changed the context. What might have been seen as competitive fire now looked like evidence of poor character and lack of control. During the break between rounds, Dexter's phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "I'm ready, Dad. Let's finish this." At 9:20 p.m., as the exhibition concluded with Rodrigo declared the winner by technical decision, the final phase of Dexter's plan activated. Mark Coffey, accompanied by Dr. McGuire and a victim's advocate, arrived at the convention center. They coordinated with Orlando Acevedo, who was prepared to conduct a live interview that would be streamed on social media and picked up by local news outlets. As Zane was still dealing with post-fight media obligations, Mark's story began broadcasting to a rapidly growing online audience. The 13-year-old spoke with quiet strength about months of systematic abuse, describing the careful pattern of violence designed to avoid detection. His testimony was devastating in its clinical detail, clearly the account of an intelligent boy who'd learned to document and analyze his own victimization. "He told me that if I ever said anything, no one would believe me," Mark said into the camera. "He said my dad was too weak to protect me, and that the police wouldn't care about a few bruises. But my counselor helped me understand that silence only protects the abuser." The live stream quickly went viral. Hashtag Justice for Mark began trending alongside the Academy abuse allegations, creating a perfect storm of negative publicity that no amount of crisis management could contain. Dexter watched from across the convention center as someone approached Zane with a phone, showing him Mark's testimony. The transformation was immediate and stark. Zane's carefully maintained public persona cracked completely, revealing the rage and violence that he usually kept hidden. The MMA fighter's first instinct was to find Mark and stop the interview through intimidation. But Dr. McGuire and the advocate had anticipated this, conducting the session from an undisclosed location with security provided by the police department's Special Victims Unit. Unable to silence his accuser, Zane turned his fury on the nearest available target, the journalist who'd started the avalanche. Orlando Acevedo was conducting follow-up interviews in the convention center's media area when Zane found him. The confrontation was captured by multiple cameras as Zane, still in his fighting gear, physically threatened the reporter. "You ruined everything," Zane shouted, grabbing Orlando by the shirt. "That kid is lying, and you're too stupid to see it." Security intervened quickly, but the damage was done. Video of a prominent community leader and business owner threatening a journalist while denying child abuse allegations spread instantly across social media. Every aspect of Zane's carefully cultivated image, the controlled fighter, the responsible businessman, the positive role model, was systematically demolished. The final blow came at 10:15 p.m. when Loretta made her own statement to the press. "I had no idea," she said, her voice breaking with genuine emotion. "I thought Mark's injuries were accidents. I believed my husband when he said the boy was clumsy, that he was imagining things. I failed to protect my stepson, and I will never forgive myself for that." Her public break with Zane completed his isolation. Within hours, sponsors began cutting ties with the academy. Several assistant instructors released their own statements about witnessing inappropriate training methods. Former students who'd been afraid to speak out began sharing their own experiences. By midnight, Zane Wolfe's empire was in ruins. The man who'd built his identity on dominance and control had been systematically destroyed by someone who understood that the most effective warfare was psychological rather than physical. Dexter left the convention center as chaos continued to unfold around Zane's crumbling world. He'd spent months studying his target, identifying every weakness, every dependency, every vulnerability. The evening's events had been orchestrated with the same precision he brought to complex surgeries, every cut calculated for maximum effect. As he drove home, Dexter reflected on the evening's success. But this was only the first stage of Zane's destruction. The public humiliation was devastating, but the legal and financial consequences would be far more comprehensive. Phase 3 was complete. Now it was time for the surgery to remove the cancer entirely. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 3 days after the charity exhibition disaster, Dexter sat in his attorney's office as Christopher Snow laid out the legal strategy that would ensure Zane Wolfe's complete destruction. The criminal charges for child abuse were only the beginning. They were pursuing civil remedies that would strip Zane of every asset, every source of income, and every possibility of rebuilding his life. "The criminal case is solid," Snow explained, spreading case files across his desk. "Mark's testimony, the medical evidence, the pattern of injuries documented over months. The district attorney is confident about securing convictions on multiple counts of child abuse and endangerment." Dexter nodded, but his attention was focused on the civil possibilities. What about the business assets? The academies are leveraged heavily. With the abuse allegations, insurance companies are canceling policies, sponsors are withdrawing support, and membership is collapsing. He'll be forced into bankruptcy within 60 days. This was exactly what Dexter had anticipated. Zane's empire was built on reputation and perception. Once those were destroyed, the financial structure would collapse like a house of cards. But Dexter wanted more than financial ruin. He wanted complete annihilation. The real estate holdings? Also leveraged, but here's where it gets interesting, Snow said with a slight smile. "I've been investigating the partnership opportunity he offered you. Turns out he's been running what amounts to a Ponzi scheme with potential investors. We've identified at least 6 individuals who've given him money for expansion projects that never materialized." Dexter felt a cold satisfaction at this revelation. Zane's greed had created additional vulnerabilities that could be exploited. How much exposure are we talking about? Conservative estimate? $2 million in fraudulent investment schemes. That's federal territory, securities fraud, wire fraud, potentially racketeering if we can establish a pattern. The conversation was interrupted by Dexter's phone. Orlando Acevedo was calling with an update on his expanded investigation. "Dr. Coffey, Orlando's voice carried excitement. "I've been contacted by the FBI. Apparently, your former stepson-in-law's problems extend beyond local child abuse charges." Dexter stepped outside the attorney's office to take the call privately. "What have they found?" "Tax evasion, money laundering through the academies, unreported income from underground fighting events. They're looking at a RICO case if they can establish the academies were being used as fronts for illegal gambling operations." Better and better. Dexter had suspected Zane's finances were questionable, but the scope of criminal activity was exceeding his expectations. "What's their timeline?" "Federal grand jury convenes next week. Local prosecutors are coordinating to ensure the state and federal cases support each other rather than competing." As Dexter ended the call, he reflected on how perfectly everything was aligning. He'd initiated the process by exposing Zane's abuse of Mark, but the investigation had uncovered a web of criminal activity that would ensure the man never recovered from his downfall. That evening, Dexter met with Mark and Dr. McGuire to discuss the upcoming legal proceedings. His son had grown visibly stronger over the past few days, as if finally telling the truth had lifted a weight from his shoulders. "How do you feel about testifying in court?" Dr. McGuire asked. "Ready," Mark replied without hesitation. "I want to make sure he can never hurt another kid." Dexter felt a surge of pride at his son's courage. The boy who'd been systematically terrorized by a man twice his size was now prepared to face his abuser in court. "You know I'll be there for every moment of this process." "I know, Dad, and I know what you did to make this possible." The statement caught Dexter off guard. "What do you mean?" Mark smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Dexter had seen from him in months. "I'm not stupid. The timing of everything, the way all these investigations started right after my accident, the way that journalists just happened to be looking into MMA Academy abuse. You orchestrated all of this." Dexter considered denying it, but his son deserved honesty. Some things needed to be exposed. Sometimes the system needs help finding the truth. "I'm glad you did it. Zane always said you were weak, that you wouldn't fight for what mattered. He was wrong about that, wasn't he?" "Very wrong." 1 week later, Dexter stood in the courtroom as Zane Wolfe was formally arraigned on 17 felony charges ranging from child abuse to securities fraud. The man who'd once radiated dangerous confidence now appeared haggard and desperate. His legal team was clearly overwhelmed by the scope of criminal charges they were facing. Loretta sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, having filed for divorce and seeking sole custody of her assets. Her testimony to prosecutors had been devastating. 3 years of observations about Zane's temper, his treatment of Mark, and his illegal business practices. The woman who'd once defended him unconditionally had become the state's most valuable witness. As the proceedings continued, Dexter observed Zane's psychological deterioration with clinical interest. The man who'd built his identity on dominance and control was discovering what it felt like to be systematically overpowered by forces beyond his influence. The fear and helplessness in his eyes was the same expression Dexter had seen on Mark's face during those terrible months. The irony was poetic. Zane was experiencing the same psychological trauma he'd inflicted on a 13-year-old child. During a break in proceedings, Zane's attorney approached Dexter in the hallway. "Dr. Coffey, my client would like to speak with you about a possible resolution." "I'm not interested in plea negotiations," Dexter replied coldly. He's not offering to plead. He wants to apologize. He recognizes that his treatment of your son was inappropriate, and he's hoping for some kind of reconciliation. Dexter stared at the attorney with the same expression he reserved for particularly incompetent residents. "Tell your client that reconciliation requires forgiveness, and I don't forgive people who hurt my son. Ever." The attorney pressed on desperately. "He's facing life in prison if convicted on all counts. A word from you about his character, about his remorse." "His character is the reason he's facing life in prison," Dexter interrupted. "And his remorse is irrelevant. He made his choices. Now he'll live with the consequences." As they returned to the courtroom, Dexter caught Zane's eye across the room. For a moment, the full weight of understanding passed between them. Zane finally realized who had orchestrated his destruction, how completely he'd been outmaneuvered, and how helpless he was to stop what was coming. The man who'd claimed to be an apex predator had discovered he was actually prey. Later that evening, Dexter received a call from Christopher Snow with the final piece of devastating news. The feds found the underground fighting operation, Snow reported. Apparently, Zane was organizing illegal matches in the basement of his main academy, taking bets, and laundering the money through legitimate business accounts. The gambling operation alone is enough for a 20-year sentence. Dexter smiled as he absorbed this information. Zane's arrogance and greed had provided the final evidence needed to ensure he would never again be in a position to hurt children. The man who'd terrorized Mark would spend the rest of his life in a cage, where his physical prowess would be irrelevant and his psychological dominance would be turned against him by genuinely dangerous predators. Justice, Dexter reflected, was sometimes more satisfying than revenge. Chapter 8. The Healing Cut. 6 months after Zane's arrest, Dexter stood in his son's bedroom, watching Mark pack for his first overnight camping trip since the abuse had been exposed. The boy who'd once flinched at sudden movements now moved with confident purpose, his recovery as methodical and complete as any successful surgery Dexter had performed. "Dad, Dr. McGuire says I'm ready to stop the intensive counseling sessions," Mark announced, carefully folding his camping gear. "She thinks I've processed everything and developed healthy coping strategies." Dexter felt a familiar surge of pride, tinged with relief he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. "How do you feel about that?" "Good. Really good." Mark paused in his packing. "I've been thinking about what happened, about what you did to stop it. I understand now why you didn't just call the police right away." "Oh, the system is designed to handle normal problems." But Zane wasn't a normal problem. He was like a cancer, and cancer requires surgical precision, not just medication. The medical metaphor wasn't lost on Dexter. His son had inherited his analytical mind and was applying it to understand the complex moral landscape they'd navigated together. "And how do you feel about the methods I used?" Mark considered this carefully. "You used Zane's own nature against him. You didn't make him abuse me, or steal money, or threaten that journalist. You just created conditions where his true character would be exposed. That's not revenge, that's justice." The distinction mattered to Dexter more than he could express. His son understood the difference between reactive violence and strategic precision. Mark had learned that strength wasn't about physical dominance or emotional outbursts. It was about having the discipline to plan, the patience to execute, and the conviction to see difficult decisions through to completion. The door chime interrupted their conversation. Dr. McGuire had arrived for their final family session, a symbolic closure to Mark's recovery process. "How are you both feeling about concluding our work together?" she asked as they settled in the living room. "Ready," Mark answered immediately. "I feel like myself again. Better than myself, actually." Dr. McGuire smiled. "That's exactly what successful trauma recovery looks like. You've not only healed from what happened, but you've developed emotional tools that will serve you throughout your life." She turned to Dexter. "And how about you? How are you processing everything that's occurred?" Dexter considered the question carefully. The months since Zane's arrest had been transformative in ways he hadn't anticipated. Watching Mark heal had reminded him of what it felt like to save a life rather than just preserve one. More importantly, he'd rediscovered his capacity for protective love, not the distant affection he'd maintained during his marriage, but the fierce, unwavering commitment that had driven him to destroy anyone who threatened his son. "I've learned something about myself," Dexter admitted. "I always thought my emotional detachment was my greatest strength as a surgeon. But it wasn't detachment that helped me handle this situation. It was clarity about what mattered most." "Can you elaborate on that?" "When Mark was brought to my ER that night, I had two choices. I could follow protocols and hope the system protected him, or I could take personal responsibility for ensuring his safety. The decision was actually simple once I understood what was at stake." Dr. McGuire nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you've found a balance between your professional objectivity and personal emotional investment. That's significant growth." As the session concluded, Dexter reflected on how much both he and Mark had changed. His son had learned that survival sometimes required confronting evil directly, That passivity in the face of abuse was complicity with the abuser. Dexter had learned that his capacity for calculated action could serve love as effectively as it served medicine. Later that evening, as Mark left for his camping trip with friends from school, Dexter received an update from Christopher Snow about Zane's legal situation. Federal trial concluded yesterday, Snow reported. Guilty on all counts. With the state charges, he's looking at 45 years without possibility of parole. The judge made specific note of the systematic child abuse in his sentencing remarks. Dexter absorbed this information with satisfaction, but no surprise. The outcome had been inevitable from the moment he decided to act rather than trust the system to protect his son. "What about Loretta?" he asked. Divorce finalized last month. She received half the legitimate assets, which amounts to almost nothing after the bankruptcy and seizures. She's moved back to her maiden name and started working as a therapist specializing in domestic abuse recovery. The irony was perfect. Loretta's experience with Zane had given her genuine insight into the psychology of abuse and control. Her professional work now focused on helping other women recognize and escape similar situations. In a strange way, her own victimization had become a source of healing for others. Any contact between Zane and Mark. Zane attempted to send letters from prison, but Mark declined to receive them. The boy made it clear he considers that chapter of his life permanently closed. As Dexter ended the call, he walked through his house, noting how much lighter the atmosphere felt. The tension that had permeated their lives during the abuse and investigation had been replaced by something resembling normalcy, but a stronger, more intentional version of normal than they'd ever experienced before. His phone buzzed with a text from Mark, made it to camp safely. "Thanks for everything, Dad. I love you." Dexter typed back, "Love you too. Have fun." Standing in his study, surrounded by medical journals and case files, Dexter reflected on the past year. He'd performed hundreds of surgeries in his career, saved countless lives, and built a reputation for clinical excellence. But none of that compared to the satisfaction of successfully protecting his son. Some people might question the methods he'd used. The manipulation, the orchestrated destruction of another human being's life, the systematic exploitation of Zane's weaknesses. These weren't the actions of a conventionally moral person. But Dexter had never been conventional. He was a surgeon, trained to cut away diseased tissue without hesitation or remorse. Zane Wolfe had been a cancer in Mark's life, and Dexter had excised him with the same precision he brought to removing tumors. The difference was that this time, he'd saved the life that mattered most to him in the world. As he prepared for bed, Dexter felt the deep satisfaction of a complex operation completed successfully. Mark was healthy, safe, and strong. Zane was neutralized permanently. Loretta was building a new life focused on helping others. The surgery was complete, and the patient would survive. Chapter 9. The Final Verdict. 2 years after Zane's imprisonment, Dexter stood in the graduation auditorium watching Mark deliver the valedictorian speech to his high school class. At 15, Mark had accelerated through his final years of school while maintaining perfect grades and developing into a confident young man who bore no visible scars from his traumatic experiences. "The greatest lesson I've learned," Mark told the audience, "is that strength isn't about physical power or the ability to dominate others. True strength comes from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and the wisdom to know when action is required." Dexter smiled as he recognized the philosophical foundation they'd built together through their shared experience. Mark understood that the world could be a dangerous place, but he'd learned to navigate that danger with intelligence and preparation rather than fear or aggression. After the ceremony, as they celebrated at Mark's favorite restaurant, Dexter's phone rang with a call from Christopher Snow. "Dr. Coffey, I have some news about Zane," the attorney said. "He was killed in prison yesterday. Apparently, some of the other inmates discovered his crimes against children." Dexter absorbed this information without surprise or particular emotion. Prison justice for child abusers was a well-documented phenomenon. Any official investigation? Routine inquiry, but these things typically resolve themselves. The guards weren't particularly motivated to prevent what happened. As Dexter ended the call, he reflected on the poetic symmetry of Zane's end. The man who'd built his identity on physical dominance had discovered that violence was ultimately self-defeating. His aggression had created the enemies who would eventually destroy him. Mark looked up from his graduation cake. Was that about Zane? He's dead. Mark considered this for a moment. Good. Now other kids are safe from him. The casual finality in his son's voice reminded Dexter that Mark had inherited more than his analytical mind. The boy understood that some problems required permanent solutions, that forgiveness wasn't always appropriate or wise, and that protecting innocence sometimes meant ensuring dangerous people couldn't hurt anyone ever again. That evening, as they walked along the river near their home, Mark broached a subject they'd never directly discussed. Dad, I know what you did to destroy Zane wasn't technically legal. You manipulated evidence, orchestrated media coverage, and basically ran a psychological warfare campaign against him. Dexter stopped walking. This was a conversation he'd been anticipating for months. And how do you feel about that? Grateful and proud. Mark met his father's eyes directly. You saw a problem that the normal systems couldn't handle quickly enough, and you created a solution that was thorough and permanent. You saved my life, and probably saved other kids from becoming his victims. Some people would say I went too far. Some people have never been terrorized by someone who's supposed to protect them. Some people don't understand that evil exists and that good people sometimes have to do harsh things to stop it. The moral sophistication in Mark's response reminded Dexter that trauma, when properly processed, could create wisdom rather than damage. His son had learned lessons about justice, power, and personal responsibility that most adults never grasped. 6 months later, Dexter received an unexpected visitor. Loretta, now going by her maiden name of Mercer, appeared at his office requesting a private conversation. I wanted to thank you, she said without preamble, and to apologize. Dexter gestured for her to sit, curious about what had motivated this meeting. For what? For protecting Mark when I failed to, and for showing me what I'd become. Her voice carried genuine remorse. I spent 3 years enabling an abuser because I was afraid of being alone, afraid of admitting I'd made a terrible mistake. My cowardice put your son in danger. You were being psychologically manipulated by an expert, Dexter replied. Recognizing that doesn't minimize your responsibility, but it explains how you could be deceived. I've been working with abuse survivors for 2 years now, and I see the same patterns I lived through. The isolation, the gradual erosion of confidence, the way abusers make you complicit in your own victimization. She paused. I understand now why you couldn't trust the system to protect Mark. You knew that even if Zane was eventually prosecuted, the legal process would take months or years while Mark remained at risk. Dexter appreciated her honesty, but forgiveness wasn't something he was prepared to offer. Understanding what happened doesn't erase the consequences. Mark suffered because the adults in his life failed to protect him. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prevent other children from experiencing what he went through. Loretta met his eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for your acknowledgement that I'm trying to make amends. Your work with abuse survivors is admirable, Dexter conceded, but it doesn't change what happened to Mark. As Loretta left, Dexter reflected on the different ways people responded to moral failure. Some, like Zane, doubled down on their destructive behavior until it destroyed them. Others, like Loretta, recognized their complicity and dedicated themselves to preventing similar harm. But recognition and repentance didn't erase the past. Mark had suffered because the adults around him had failed to prioritize his safety. Dexter would never forget that lesson, and he would never forgive those whose weakness had enabled his son's victimization. 5 years after Zane's death, Dexter stood in another graduation audience as Mark received his engineering degree from MIT at 19. His son had chosen to specialize in biomedical engineering, developing technologies to help children with physical disabilities, a career path that channeled his experience with trauma into constructive action. During the celebration dinner, Mark raised a toast that brought everything full circle. To my father, he said, who taught me that protecting the people we love requires more than good intentions. It It requires the courage to act decisively, the intelligence to plan effectively, and the conviction to see difficult decisions through to completion. Dexter raised his glass, recognizing in his son the man he'd hoped to raise, someone who understood that strength served love, that justice sometimes required personal action, and that forgiveness was a choice rather than an obligation. As they walked through Cambridge after dinner, Mark voiced the philosophy that had guided them both through their shared trial. People think forgiveness is about being a good person, he said, but sometimes refusing to forgive is about protecting other innocent people from dangerous predators. Sometimes the most moral thing you can do is ensure that evil people face consequences severe enough to prevent them from hurting anyone else. Dexter nodded, proud of his son's moral clarity. Mark had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the world contained genuinely dangerous people, and that protecting the innocent sometimes required destroying the guilty. Some would call this philosophy harsh or unforgiving. Dexter called it surgical precision applied to life's most critical problems. The operation had been successful, and the patient had not only survived but thrived. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Foundation. Dylan Torres had learned early in life that appearances could be deceiving. At 34, he maintained a facade of a simple construction foreman, coming home each evening with dirt under his fingernails and concrete dust in his hair. What his wife Brianna didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Dylan had spent 8 years in military intelligence before transitioning to civilian life. His current job was deliberate cover, allowing him to move through different social circles unnoticed while building a network of contacts that spanned from blue-collar workers to high society elites. Their marriage had started as a fairy tale. Brianna Walsh, the beautiful daughter of a prominent real estate family, had met Dylan at a charity fundraiser 5 years ago. She'd been drawn to his quiet confidence and piercing blue eyes, mistaking his controlled demeanor for simple honesty. Dylan had been genuinely smitten with her golden hair and bright smile, but more importantly, he'd seen her the perfect civilian life he'd craved after years of shadows and secrets. The Walsh family had initially opposed the match. Richard Walsh, Brianna's father, made no secret of his disappointment that his daughter was marrying beneath her station. Her mother, Patricia, was more subtle but equally disapproving. Her younger brother, Kevin, openly mocked Dylan at family gatherings, calling him the hired help behind his back. Only Brianna had defended him in those early days, her eyes blazing with the fire Dylan had fallen for. But over the past year, that fire had dimmed. Dylan noticed the small changes first. The way she'd grown distant during their conversations, how she'd started working late at her family's real estate firm, the new wardrobe that seemed designed for someone else's eyes. As someone trained to read people, Dylan recognized the signs of deception, but he'd hoped he was wrong. He'd wanted to be wrong. Their small house in Millbrook had become a stage where they performed the roles of a happy couple. Dylan would arrive home at 6, shower off the day's work, and sit down to dinner with a wife who was increasingly elsewhere, even when she was physically present. She'd scroll through her phone during meals, claim headaches when he reached for her at night, and find excuses to avoid spending weekends together. Dylan's real work, the consulting he did for private security firms, the discreet investigations he handled for old military contacts, happened in the hours when Brianna thought he was sleeping. He'd built a reputation in underground circles as someone who could solve problems that required both intelligence and ruthlessness. The construction job provided perfect cover and legitimate income, but his real money came from jobs that would have terrified his wife had she known about them. The irony wasn't lost on him. Brianna was cheating on one of the few men in the city who could destroy someone's life without leaving fingerprints, and she had no idea. He'd given her everything she'd asked for, a stable home, faithfulness, and his complete devotion. In return, she'd given him contempt disguised as marriage. As their 5th anniversary approached, Dylan made a decision. He would give Brianna one final chance to come clean, to remember what they'd once meant to each other. If she chose deception instead of honesty, he would show her exactly who she'd married and what happened to people who betrayed Dylan Torres. The anniversary party was Brianna's idea, naturally. She wanted to celebrate at the Millbrook Country Club, surrounded by her family and their social circle. Dylan had agreed, even though he knew the guest list would be filled with people who'd never respected him. He'd even paid for the entire event, using money from a recent job that had involved permanently relocating a Russian oligarch's assets. As he stood in their bedroom, adjusting his tie for the party, Dylan caught Brianna's reflection in the mirror. She was beautiful in her red dress, but there was something calculated about her appearance tonight. She looked like a woman preparing for war, not celebration. "You clean up nice for a construction worker," she said, her tone carrying an edge he'd been hearing more often lately. Dylan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" She shrugged, focusing on her earrings. "Take it however you want." He studied her for a long moment, memorizing every detail. After tonight, everything would change. "Brianna," he said softly, "is there anything you want to tell me before we go?" For just an instant, he saw something flicker in her eyes, guilt, perhaps, or fear. But it was gone quickly, replaced by the cold stranger she'd become. "Like what?" she asked. "Like the truth." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're being dramatic, Dylan. Come on, we'll be late for our own party." As they drove to the country club, Dylan made one final decision. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the envelope he'd prepared. Inside were documents that would change everything, not just for Brianna, but for everyone who'd participated in her deception. The contents represented months of careful planning and investigation, the kind of thorough preparation that had kept him alive during his military years. Tonight, Dylan Torres would remind everyone why it was dangerous to underestimate a quiet man. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. The Millbrook Country Club sparkled under crystal chandeliers as guests arrived for the Torres anniversary celebration. Dylan recognized most of the faces, Brianna's family, her co-workers from Walsh Realty, and various members of their social circle. What struck him was how many of them avoided direct eye contact, offering instead the kind of pitying smiles reserved for men who were the last to know about their wives' infidelity. Trevor Hoffman arrived fashionably late, his silver Porsche pulling up to the valet stand with deliberate flair. Dylan watched from across the room as Trevor made his entrance, tall, perfectly groomed, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. He was everything Dylan appeared not to be: wealthy, connected, and born into the kind of privilege that opened doors without effort. What made it particularly galling was that Dylan had introduced them. Trevor was a client from 6 months ago, though he didn't know Dylan's real identity. He'd hired Dylan through intermediaries to handle a delicate problem involving a business rival who'd been spreading damaging rumors. Dylan had solved the problem efficiently, and Trevor had been so impressed that he'd recommended Dylan's services to others in his circle. The irony was perfect and bitter. Trevor was sleeping with Dylan's wife, never suspecting that the quiet construction worker he occasionally nodded to at social events was the same shadow operator who'd saved his reputation. Dylan positioned himself at the bar, nursing a whiskey and watching the subtle interactions around the room. His trained eye caught the meaningful glances between Brianna and Trevor, the way her brother Kevin smirked whenever he looked in Dylan's direction, and the uncomfortable shifting of guests who clearly knew more than they were saying. Patricia Walsh approached the bar, her smile as artificial as her jewelry. "Dylan, dear, you look handsome tonight, though I do hope you washed all the construction dust off first." Her laugh was like broken glass. "I always clean up well, Mrs. Walsh," Dylan replied evenly. "It's amazing what people don't see when they're not really looking." Something in his tone made her pause, but before she could respond, Richard Walsh joined them. Brianna's father was a large man who'd grown soft from years of easy living, but he still carried himself with the arrogance of inherited wealth. "Dylan," Richard said, his greeting perfunctory, I was just telling Trevor about that new development we're planning in the hills. He might be interested in investing. Dylan's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his glass. Trevor Hoffman? The real estate developer. The very one. Successful man, that Trevor. Self-made, ambitious. The kind of man who knows how to seize opportunities. Richard's emphasis on the last word was unmistakable. I'm sure he does, Dylan said quietly. I imagine he's very good at taking what doesn't belong to him. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but before he could respond, the club's event coordinator announced that dinner was about to be served. As guests moved toward their tables, Dylan noticed how naturally Brianna and Trevor ended up seated near each other, despite supposedly random seating arrangements. During dinner, Dylan played the role of devoted husband perfectly. He laughed at the appropriate moments, nodded along with conversations, and gave a brief speech thanking everyone for celebrating their anniversary. But internally, he was cataloging every slight, every smirk, every knowing look exchange between the conspirators around him. Kevin Walsh, emboldened by wine and surrounded by his family's enablers, decided to entertain the table with stories about Dylan's humble background. Remember when Brianna first brought him home? Kevin laughed. Dad thought she was joking. A construction worker. We figured it was just a phase. Kevin, Brianna said, but her protest was half-hearted. No, it's fine, Dylan said, his voice carrying just enough edge to make Kevin pause. I've always believed that a man's worth isn't determined by his job title. It's determined by what he's capable of when pushed too far. The table fell silent for a moment, the temperature seeming to drop several degrees. Trevor leaned forward, his eyes curious. That's an interesting philosophy, Dylan. Very intense. Dylan met his gaze directly. I learned it in the military. 8 years of dealing with people who underestimated quiet men. It's amazing how often that becomes their final mistake. Trevor's smile faltered slightly. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that there might be more to their mild-mannered host than they'd assumed. As dessert was being served, Dylan excused himself to step outside. The evening air was cool against his skin as he walked to the parking lot. Pulling out a secure phone he kept for his real work. He dialed a number from memory. Rodriguez here. Carlos, it's Torres. I need a favor. Dylan? Shit, man. I haven't heard from you in months. What do you need? Background check on a Trevor Hoffman. Real estate developer. Drives a silver Porsche. Probably has some dirty laundry he'd prefer stayed hidden. How deep do you want me to dig? All the way to bedrock. Financial records, personal history, anything that could be used as leverage. And Carlos? I need it fast. This personal? Dylan looked back toward the country club, where his wife was probably making eyes at her lover while surrounded by people who thought he was too stupid to notice. Very. I'll have something for you by morning. You okay, Hermano? I will be. As Dylan walked back toward the club, he saw Trevor stepping out for a smoke. They met on the pathway, two men who knew each other far better than either realized. Hell of a party, Trevor said, lighting a cigarette with gold lighter. Your wife knows how to put on an event. She's always been good at performances, Dylan replied, though I'm starting to wonder who her real audience is. Trevor's hand paused halfway to his mouth. What do you mean? Dylan stepped closer, close enough that Trevor could see the cold calculation in his eyes. I mean that some performances have consequences when the wrong person figures out what's really going on. For a moment, Trevor looked genuinely nervous. Then he seemed to remember who he was supposed to be. The successful businessman talking to the simple construction worker. His confidence returned. You sound paranoid, friend. Maybe you should trust your wife more. Dylan smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was genuine. Trust is earned, Trevor, and it can be lost very quickly when people make the wrong choices. As they walked back inside together, Dylan felt a familiar calm settling over him. It was the same feeling he'd had before complex operations in the field, the certainty that came with having a plan and the skills to execute it. Trevor Hoffman and everyone else who'd participated in his humiliation were about to learn exactly who they'd been underestimating. The anniversary party was about to become a very different kind of celebration. Chapter 3. The Revelation. The moment arrived during the gift presentation. Patricia Walsh had insisted on making it a public affair, encouraging guests to share their presence and well wishes for the happy couple. Dylan watched as Brianna received jewelry, wine, and expensive trinkets from their friends and family, her smile bright and hollow as a carnival mask. When it was time for the couple to exchange gifts, Brianna went first. She presented Dylan with an expensive watch, the kind of gesture that looked generous but felt perfunctory. "To my hard-working husband," she announced to the crowd, "who always puts in such long hours." The irony wasn't lost on Dylan. She thought his long hours were spent pouring concrete, when he was actually building the kind of network that could destroy lives with a phone call. When his turn came, Dylan stood slowly, every eye in the room upon him. He'd been waiting for this moment since the evening began, watching the subtle interplay between his wife and her lover, cataloging the smirks and knowing glances of people who thought they were witnessing a fool's celebration. "Before I give Brianna her gift," Dylan said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room, "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It's not often you get to see exactly who your real friends are." Something in his tone made several guests shift uncomfortably. Brianna's smile flickered slightly. "Marriage is about trust," Dylan continued, his eyes moving deliberately around the room, lingering on specific faces. "It's about honesty. It's about having someone who has your back when the rest of the world turns against you." His gaze settled on Trevor, who had gone very still. "Of course, that only works when both people are actually committed to the marriage." "Dylan," Brianna said, her voice carrying a warning note. He ignored her, reaching into his jacket pocket. "5 years ago, I married a woman I thought I knew. A woman I believed would stand by me through anything. A woman who promised to love, honor, and cherish me until death do us part." The room was completely silent now. Even the wait staff had stopped moving. "But sometimes," Dylan said, pulling out the envelope, "you discover that the person you married isn't who you thought they were. Sometimes you find out that while you were working to build a life together, they were busy tearing it down behind your back." Brianna's face had gone pale. "What are you doing?" Dylan looked at her for a long moment, memorizing the fear in her eyes. Then he turned to address the room again. "At the anniversary party, my wife announced, 'I married a broke loser who can't provide,' as her family laughed. But before she could speak, Dylan held up his hand. "Actually, let me save you the trouble, darling. I know exactly what you think of me. I've heard the conversations you think I can't hear. I've seen the messages you think I can't access. I know about the meetings you think I don't know about." Kevin Walsh started to stand, but something in Dylan's expression made him sink back into his chair. "So here's my anniversary gift to my beloved wife," Dylan said, placing the envelope on the cake table with deliberate ceremony. "Happy anniversary, darling." The envelope was thick, sealed with red wax that gleamed under the chandelier lights. Brianna stared at it as if it were a snake. "Open it," Dylan said softly. "Dylan, please," she whispered, but her voice was barely audible. "Open it, or I will." With trembling hands, Brianna broke the seal. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Her face went white as she looked at the first image, then red as she flipped through the rest. The photos showed her and Trevor in various compromising situations, entering hotels together, kissing in restaurant parking lots, embracing in his car. But that wasn't all. Mixed in with the surveillance photos were documents that made Trevor's face drain of color. Financial records showing suspicious transactions, evidence of permit violations on his construction projects, and correspondence with city officials that suggested bribery. "You see," Dylan said, his voice conversational, "I've been working very long hours lately. But not the kind of hours you thought." Brianna dropped the photographs as if they were on fire. Several scattered across the floor, clearly visible to the horrified guests. "Dylan," Trevor started to speak, but Dylan cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. "Trevor Hoffman," Dylan said, his voice carrying military authority now. "Real estate developer, tax evader, and apparently, a man who enjoys taking what doesn't belong to him. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Trevor's expensive suit suddenly looked like costume on a terrified actor. "I don't know what you think you know, but nothing." Dylan's voice was ice. "I know exactly what you are, what you've done, and what you're going to do next. He walked to the edge of the room, where guests were beginning to murmur and shift toward the exits. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for ruining your evening, but I wanted you all to see this because some of you already knew. Some of you have been laughing behind my back for months, thinking I was too stupid to figure out what was happening in my own marriage. Richard Walsh finally found his voice. Dylan, I think you're overreacting. Am I, Richard? Dylan's smile was sharp as a blade. Your daughter has been having an affair for 8 months. Your family has been treating me like a joke for years. And tonight was supposed to be my humiliation party, wasn't it? The night when poor, stupid Dylan finally got the public embarrassment you all thought he deserved. He walked back to the cake table, his movements controlled and predatory. But here's what none of you understood. You didn't marry your daughter to a construction worker, Richard. You married her to someone far more dangerous than you could have imagined. Dylan pulled out his phone and walked outside, the crowd parting before him like water. As he reached the parking lot, he could hear voices rising behind him. Brianna screaming, Trevor shouting denials, and the general chaos of a social gathering collapsing into scandal. He dialed a number and waited for it to connect. It's Torres. Phase 1 is complete. You can begin Phase 2. Copy that. How loud do you want this to get? Dylan looked back at the country club, where he could see figures moving frantically past the windows. Through the glass, he could see Brianna holding the scattered photographs, her perfect party destroyed, her secret exposed, her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. When she opened it, Dylan said into the phone, watching his wife's world collapse in real time, she screamed. And she was still screaming. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. By morning, Dylan's phone had received 17 missed calls from Brianna and 43 text messages ranging from desperate apologies to furious accusations. He ignored them all while reviewing the additional intelligence Carlos Rodriguez had provided overnight. Trevor Hoffman's background was even dirtier than Dylan had hoped. The financial irregularities went back years, involving shell companies, falsified permits, and a network of city officials who'd been taking bribes in exchange for favorable zoning decisions. But more importantly, Carlos had uncovered Trevor's pattern of predatory behavior toward married women. Apparently, Brianna wasn't his first conquest among the wives of men he considered beneath him. Dylan sat in his kitchen, methodically organizing the information into categories: financial crimes, personal indiscretions, and professional misconduct. Each category represented a different pressure point, a different way to apply leverage. His military training had taught him that the most effective operations attacked multiple fronts simultaneously, preventing the enemy from regrouping or mounting an effective defense. The front door slammed open, and Brianna burst in, still wearing her dress from the night before. Her makeup was smeared, her perfect hair disheveled, and her eyes were red from crying, or rage, or both. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she screamed, throwing her purse across the room. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What you destroyed?" Dylan looked up from his papers, his expression calm. "I've destroyed a lie, Brianna. The truth was always going to come out eventually." "The truth?" She laughed hysterically. "The truth is that you're a pathetic, vindictive man who can't handle the fact that his wife found someone better." "Better?" Dylan set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "You mean Trevor? The man who's been stealing from the city for years? The man who's done this exact same thing to at least 6 other married women? The man who was planning to dump you as soon as he got bored?" Brianna's face went white. "That's not true." Dylan reached for another folder, this one containing screenshots of Trevor's text messages with other women, including recent conversations about wrapping up the Walsh situation and moving on to greener pastures. He slid the papers across the table toward her. "Read them," he said quietly. "All of them. See how special you really were to him." Brianna's hand shook as she picked up the first page. Dylan watched her face change as she read Trevor's casual dismissal of their relationship, his crude descriptions of their encounters, and his mocking comments about her emotional investment in their affair. "He called you the construction worker's desperate wife," Dylan said, his voice clinically detached. "Said you were easy but exhausting, and that he'd have to find a way to cut you loose without too much drama." The papers scattered from Brianna's fingers as she collapsed into a chair. For a moment, Dylan almost felt sorry for her. Then he remembered the laughter at the country club, the months of lies, and the contempt in her voice every time she'd called him a broke loser. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you do this to us? We could have worked things out. We could have worked things out." Dylan's voice was dangerously quiet. "When were you planning to have that conversation, Brianna? Before or after you humiliated me in front of everyone we know? You never meant to get caught." Dylan stood, his full height and military bearing suddenly imposing in the small kitchen. "But you meant every lie, every betrayal, every moment you looked me in the eye and pretended we had a marriage worth saving." Brianna tried a different approach, the manipulation tactics that had worked on him in the past. "Dylan, please. I made a mistake. I was confused, lonely. You worked so much, and I felt neglected. Can't you understand?" "Understand perfectly," Dylan said. "You felt entitled to destroy our marriage because you were bored. You felt justified in making me look like a fool because you thought I was too stupid to figure it out. And you felt safe doing it because you thought I was harmless." He walked to the window, looking out the street where they'd once planned to build a life together. "But that's where you made your real mistake, Brianna. You never knew who you married. You saw what you wanted to see. A simple man with a simple job who would provide for you and never ask difficult questions." "Then who are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Dylan turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw him without his carefully constructed mask. The man looking at her wasn't the mild-mannered construction worker she'd married. This was someone harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. "I'm someone who solves problems, Brianna. Permanently. I'm someone who's very good at making people disappear when they become inconvenient. I'm someone who spent years learning how to destroy lives so thoroughly that the targets never recover." Brianna shrank back in her chair. "You're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared. Because everything you thought you knew about your husband was a lie designed to keep you safe. But you threw that safety away when you decided I wasn't worth your loyalty." Dylan's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled, though there was no warmth in the expression. "Trevor's been arrested," he announced casually. "Federal charges. It seems someone tipped off the FBI about his financial irregularities. They're calling it the largest municipal corruption case in the state's history." Brianna stared at him in horror. "You did this." "I did this," Dylan confirmed. "And this is just the beginning. By the time I'm finished, everyone who participated in your little deception will understand exactly what happens when they make the mistake of betraying me." "Dylan, you can't. I could do whatever I want, Brianna. That's what you never understood. I've been holding myself back for 5 years, trying to be the man you said you wanted. But that man was never real. He was just a role I played because I thought you were worth the performance." Dylan walked toward the door, pausing to look back at his wife one final time. "Pack your things and get out. The house is in my name, the accounts are frozen, and your credit cards have been canceled. Your family's business is about to face some very difficult times, and your lover is going to prison for a very long time. Where am I supposed to go?" Brianna asked desperately. Dylan's smile was arctic. "That's not my problem anymore. You wanted someone better than a broke loser who can't provide? Now you can find out what it's like to have nothing at all." As he reached for the door handle, Brianna called out one last time. "I'm sorry, Dylan. I'm so sorry. Can't we please try to work this out?" Dylan paused, his hand on the door. For just a moment, she might have seen a flicker of the man she'd married. Then it was gone, replaced by something infinitely colder. "Some things can't be worked out, Brianna. Some betrayals are unforgivable. And some people learn too late that actions have consequences." He walked out, leaving her alone in the house that was no longer hers, surrounded by the wreckage of a life she'd thrown away for a man who'd never loved her at all. The real work was just beginning. Chapter 5, The Network. Dylan's next stop was a nondescript office building downtown, the kind of place that housed accounting firms and insurance agencies. But on the third floor, behind a door marked Alpine Consulting, was the nerve center of an operation that most people would never suspect existed. Maria Santos looked up from her computer screens as Dylan entered. At 52, she was a former NSA analyst who'd grown tired of government bureaucracy and had joined Dylan's private network 3 years ago. Her ability to dig up information was legendary, and her loyalty was absolute. "I heard about last night," she said without preamble. "Carlos sent me the preliminary reports. How deep do you want to go?" Dylan settled into a chair across from her desk, his expression grim. "All the way. Every person who knew about the affair and said nothing. Every family member who participated in humiliating me. Everyone who thought they could treat me like a fool without consequences." Maria's fingers flew across her keyboard. "I've already started background checks on the Walsh family. Richard's real estate business isn't as clean as it appears. There are some questionable land deals, a few partnerships with people who have interesting connections." "What kind of connections?" "The kind that don't like publicity. Richard borrowed money from some very private lenders to finance his expansion last year. The terms were generous, almost too generous." Dylan leaned forward, interested. "Which means they expect something in return." "Exactly. And if their investment suddenly became a liability?" Maria let the implication hang in the air. "What about Patricia and Kevin?" "Patricia sits on several charity boards. Substantial money flows through those organizations, and the accounting isn't as transparent as it should be. Kevin's been trading on inside information from his father's real estate deals. Small-scale stuff, but enough to interest the SEC if someone pointed them in the right direction." Dylan absorbed this information, already formulating plans. "I want comprehensive dossiers on everyone who was at that party. Cross-reference their financial records, personal histories, anything that could be used as leverage. Already in progress." "But Dylan," Maria's expression grew serious. "This isn't like our usual jobs. These people are connected to your personal life. Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Your marriage is over, but your life as Dylan Torres, construction worker, is over too." "That life ended last night," Dylan said firmly. "Brianna and her family spent years treating me like I was beneath them. They thought they were safe because they believed I was harmless. It's time they learned better." Maria nodded and returned to her screens. "There's something else you should know. I've been monitoring communications since last night. Trevor hired a lawyer, a good one. He's not going quietly." "What's his strategy?" "He's claiming the evidence against him was obtained illegally. He's also making noise about filing charges against you for harassment and invasion of privacy." Dylan smiled coldly. "Let him try. Everything we have on him was obtained through legal channels. And if he wants to escalate this to a legal battle, I have resources he can't imagine." As if summoned by their conversation, Dylan's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. "Dylan Torres." "Mr. Torres, this is Jonathan Blackstone. I represent Trevor Hoffman. I think we need to talk." "I don't think we do. My client is willing to make certain accommodations to resolve this situation quietly. Perhaps we could meet and discuss terms that would be mutually beneficial." Dylan put the phone on speaker so Maria could hear. "Your client is in federal custody. I'm not sure what accommodations he thinks he can make. Mr. Hoffman has information that might be of interest to certain parties. Information that could make this entire situation disappear if handled correctly." "Are you suggesting your client is willing to cooperate with federal investigators?" There was a pause. "I'm suggesting that Mr. Hoffman is a businessman who understands the value of negotiation. He's prepared to make significant concessions to avoid prolonged legal proceedings." Dylan looked at Maria, who was already pulling up additional files on her computer. "Mr. Blackstone, tell your client that I'm not interested in negotiations. He made his choices when he decided to sleep with my wife. Now he can live with the consequences. Mr. Torres, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. My client has connections throughout the city's business community. His testimony could implicate a great many people in activities they prefer to keep private. Some of those people might view you as a threat to their interests." "Is that a threat, counselor?" "It's a warning. My client is prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation, but that cooperation might lead to revelations that affect more than just Mr. Hoffman's business dealings." Dylan's smile was predatory. "Mr. Blackstone, tell your client that if he thinks he can threaten me into backing down, he's about to discover exactly how wrong he is. And tell him that every time he opens his mouth to make a deal, I'll find new ways to make his life miserable. He hung up and looked at Maria. How quickly can we expand the investigation? What are you thinking? Trevor's lawyer just told us that he's connected to a broader network of corruption. If he wants to cooperate with investigators, let's give them so much evidence that his testimony becomes irrelevant. Maria's fingers were already flying across her keyboard. I'll need additional resources. This kind of comprehensive investigation requires more than just our usual contacts. Use whatever you need. Call in favors, hire specialists, bring in anyone who can help us map the entire network of corruption in this city. Dylan, that could take months and cost. I don't care what it costs. Dylan's voice was steel. These people thought they could humiliate me because I was nobody important. They're about to learn that the quiet man they ignored has the power to destroy everything they've built. As Dylan left the office, his phone buzzed with another message from Brianna. This one was different from the others, shorter, more desperate. Please call me. We need to talk. It's important. Dylan stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Brianna had had months to talk to him honestly. Now it was too late for conversation. The war had begun, and Dylan Torres intended to win it completely. Chapter 6, The Trap. 3 days after the anniversary party, Dylan received an unexpected visitor. He was reviewing financial documents in his home office when the doorbell rang. Through the security camera he'd installed after moving out his wife, he saw a woman he didn't recognize. Middle-aged, expensively dressed, with the kind of composed bearing that suggested either wealth or authority. When he opened the door, she introduced herself with a firm handshake. Mr. Torres? I'm Catherine Reynolds. I represent certain interested parties who would like to discuss your recent activities. Dylan's military training kicked in immediately. Catherine Reynolds wasn't a lawyer. Her posture and the way her eyes cataloged his surroundings suggested intelligence or law enforcement background. But she wasn't official either, or she would have led with credentials. I'm not sure what activities you're referring to, Dylan said carefully. May I come in? This conversation would be better conducted privately. Dylan stepped aside, his mind racing through possibilities. Catherine entered and declined his offer of coffee, instead settling into a chair with the confident air of someone accustomed to being in control of conversations. Mr. Torres, I represent a group of individuals who have significant investments in this city's development projects. Your actions regarding Trevor Hoffman have created some complications for our operations. Trevor's legal troubles are his own doing, of course, but the investigation you've triggered is expanding beyond Mr. Hoffman's personal indiscretions. Federal investigators are now examining land deals, permit processes, and financial relationships that have nothing to do with your marital problems. Dylan sat across from her, his expression neutral. That sounds like a law enforcement issue, not my concern. Catherine smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Torres, we know who you are. We know about your military background, your current consulting work, and your rather impressive network of contacts. We also know that you have the skills to make this situation either much better or much worse for everyone involved. I'm still not hearing a specific request. We'd like to hire you, Catherine said simply. Your investigation has uncovered information that could be valuable to us. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for your cooperation and your discretion. Dylan leaned back, studying her. And if I refuse, then we'd be forced to take other measures to protect our interests. Nothing unpleasant, you understand, but there are many ways to make someone's life complicated. It was a mistake. Catherine Reynolds had just threatened Dylan Torres, and she clearly didn't understand what that meant. Ms. Reynolds, Dylan said quietly, I think you've misunderstood something fundamental about this situation. I'm not trying to extort anyone or profit from information. I'm not interested in deals or accommodations. I'm destroying people who betrayed me, and I'm going to continue until I'm satisfied they've paid an appropriate price. Catherine's composure flickered slightly. Mr. Torres, you're playing with forces beyond your understanding. The people I represent have resources and connections that what? Exceed mine. Dylan's smile was cold. Ms. Reynolds, do you know what I did before I became a construction worker? Intelligence work, military consulting. We've done our research. then you should know that I spent 8 years learning how to identify, infiltrate, and destroy organizations exactly like the one you represent. You should know that I have contacts and agencies that could make your employers' lives very interesting. And you should know that threatening me was the single stupidest thing you could have done. Dylan stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a thick folder. This contains financial records, communication intercepts, and surveillance reports on a network of individuals involved in municipal corruption spanning the last 5 years. Your employers are prominently featured throughout. Catherine's face had gone pale. How did you get this information? The same way I got everything else. While you and your people were assuming I was a harmless nobody, I was building a case that could destroy every person at every level of your organization. Dylan opened the folder and began laying out photographs on the coffee table between them. Here's your boss meeting with city planning officials. Here's the cash exchange. Here's the falsified environmental impact report. Here's the shell company used to launder the bribes. With each photograph, Catherine seemed to shrink further into her chair. But here's the interesting part, Dylan continued. I wasn't initially interested in your organization. You weren't on my target list. But you just put yourselves there by coming to my house and threatening me. Mr. Torres, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. You came here to intimidate me into backing down. Instead, you've just declared war on someone who's very good at winning wars. Catherine stood abruptly, her professional composure finally cracking. You don't know what you're getting into. These people don't just make problems disappear. They make people disappear. Dylan's expression didn't change. Ms. Reynolds, I've made people disappear professionally. The difference is I was usually being paid to do it legally. Your employers won't have that luxury. As Catherine moved toward the door, Dylan called after her. Tell your bosses that they have 48 hours to withdraw all support from Trevor Hoffman and anyone else involved in my wife's deception. After that, the evidence I've gathered goes to every federal agency with jurisdiction. And if they refuse, Dylan's smile was genuinely terrifying. Then they'll discover exactly how creative I can be when people try to protect those who betrayed me. After Catherine left, Dylan immediately called Maria Santos. We have a problem, he said without preamble. The corruption network is bigger than we thought, and they just tried to intimidate me into backing down. How big? Big enough to send a professional negotiator to my house. Big enough to have federal investigations worried. Big enough to think they can threaten me and survive the consequences. Maria was quiet for a moment. Dylan, if these people are connected to organized crime or foreign interests, this could get very dangerous very quickly. Then we move faster. I want everything we have on every person connected to this network compiled and ready for distribution within 24 hours. Every financial crime, every illegal contact, every dirty deal. That's not enough time to verify everything properly. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be devastating. As Dylan hung up, he felt the familiar calm that came before major operations. Catherine Reynolds and her employers had made the same mistake as his wife and her family. They'd assumed he was someone they could manipulate or intimidate. They were about to learn better. Chapter 7. The Assault. The federal task force hit Trevor Hoffman's properties at dawn on Thursday morning, less than 48 hours after Catherine Reynolds had visited Dylan. The simultaneous raids on Trevor's office, his penthouse apartment, and his construction sites were coordinated with military precision, executed by agents who'd been given detailed intelligence about exactly where to look for evidence. Dylan watched the news coverage from Maria's office, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as reporters described the largest municipal corruption investigation in decades. The evidence Dylan had provided had given federal investigators enough ammunition to secure warrants for dozens of locations and hundreds of financial records. Phase 1 complete, Maria said, monitoring multiple news feeds on her array of screens. Trevor's looking at minimum 20 years if convicted on all charges. His lawyer's already reaching out about a plea deal. What about the Reynolds organization? Radio silence since yesterday. Their legitimate businesses are operating normally, but the people you identified haven't been seen since Catherine visited you. Dylan nodded, unsurprised. Organizations like Catherine's didn't survive by fighting battles they couldn't win. They'd cut their losses and disappear, leaving Trevor and his associates to face the consequences alone. "Sir," said Marcus Webb, Dylan's youngest operative, looking up from his computer, "I've got movement on the Walsh family situation." Richards received 3 calls from his private lenders in the past hour. Apparently, news of his son-in-law's federal investigation has made them nervous about their investment. How nervous? Nervous enough to demand immediate repayment of his outstanding loans. We're talking about $12 million due within 30 days. Dylan allowed himself a small smile. Richard Walsh had spent years treating him like hired help, secure in his position as a successful businessman. Now he was about to discover how quickly success could turn to ruin when the wrong people decided you were a liability. What about Patricia and Kevin? Patricia's charity board memberships are under review. Apparently, someone filed anonymous complaints about financial irregularities with several oversight agencies. Kevin's stock trading has caught the SEC's attention. They're opening an investigation into possible insider trading violations. Excellent. Make sure the investigators have all the evidence they need to build solid cases. Dylan's phone rang, displaying Brianna's number. He'd been expecting this call since the raids began. "Dylan, please." Brianna's voice was barely controlled panic. "You have to stop this. My family is being destroyed. My father could lose everything." "Your family destroyed themselves through their own actions," Dylan replied calmly. "I'm just ensuring that the appropriate authorities are aware of those actions. Trevor never told me about any illegal activities. I had no idea." "You had no idea because you were too busy planning your affair to pay attention to what kind of man you were sleeping with." "Dylan, please. I know I hurt you, but this is going too far. My family has nothing to do with what happened between us." Dylan walked to the window, looking down at the city where so many lives were about to change forever. "Your family had everything to do with it, Brianna. They enabled your betrayal. They encouraged it. They participated in humiliating me because they thought I was powerless to respond. They're facing prison, Dylan. My father, my brother, they could go to jail for years. They should have considered that before they decided to break the law. Just like you should have considered the consequences before you decided to break your marriage vows." There was a long silence before Brianna spoke again, her voice smaller now. "What do you want from me? What can I do to make this stop?" Dylan had been waiting for this question. "There's nothing you can do, Brianna. This isn't about what I want anymore. This is about natural consequences. You made choices, your family made choices, and now everyone has to live with the results. I'll do anything. I'll leave town. I'll disappear. You'll do nothing," Dylan said firmly. "You'll live with what you've done, and you'll watch as everything your family built crumbles around them. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew? Now you can experience that humiliation yourself." He ended the call and turned back to Maria and Marcus. "Status on the media coverage?" "Comprehensive," Maria replied. "Every major news outlet in the region is covering the corruption investigation. Trevor's name is linked to your wife's family in most reports. Social media is having a field day with the anniversary party revenge angle." Marcus looked up from his screen. "Sir, I'm seeing some concerning chatter on encrypted channels. It looks like Catherine's people are regrouping. They might not be as willing to cut their losses as we hoped." Dylan's expression hardened. "What kind of chatter?" "References to permanent solutions and removing complications. They seem to think you're a threat that needs to be eliminated." "Good," Dylan said, surprising both his operatives. "That means they're scared enough to make mistakes." "Sir, Marcus, I want you to monitor all communications from that organization. If they're planning to move against me, I want to know about it before they act." "Maria, begin phase 2 of the Walsh investigation. It's time to accelerate their financial collapse." "What about security?" Maria asked. "If these people are talking about permanent solutions, let them try," Dylan said quietly. "I've been waiting 5 years to show people who I really am. If Catherine's organization wants to escalate this to physical violence, they'll discover that they've made the worst mistake of their lives." As his team returned to their work, Dylan felt the familiar anticipation that came before complex operations. The legal destruction of his enemies was proceeding ahead of schedule, but the personal satisfaction would come from watching them realize exactly how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. The quiet construction worker they dismissed was about to remind everyone why it was dangerous to underestimate a man trained in the art of war. Chapter 8. The Execution. The attempt on Dylan's life came exactly when he expected it. Thursday night, as he returned home from dinner alone at the small diner where he'd eaten countless meals during his marriage. Two men waited in the shadows of his driveway, professionals who moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this kind of work before. What they didn't expect was that Dylan had been watching them for the past hour through surveillance equipment he'd installed throughout his neighborhood. They also didn't expect him to come through the back door of his own house while they waited at the front. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Dylan's military training had never left him, and men who relied on intimidation and surprise were no match for someone who'd spent years learning to kill efficiently and quietly. When it was over, both attackers were unconscious, zip-tied, and sitting in Dylan's basement with hoods over their heads. "Gentlemen," Dylan said conversationally as they came to consciousness, "I appreciate your professionalism. Most people would have just tried to beat me up or threaten my family. You came here to kill me, which shows you understand the stakes." One of the men tried to speak through his hood, but Dylan ignored him. "However, you've also just committed a federal crime by attempting to murder someone who's cooperating with an ongoing FBI investigation. Your employers have made what we call in the military a tactical error." Dylan pulled out his phone and showed them a video feed from his security cameras, clearly displaying their faces as they'd approached his house with weapons drawn. This footage is already uploaded to 3 separate secure servers and has been automatically forwarded to federal investigators. Even if you'd succeeded in killing me, you'd have been identified and arrested within hours. He removed their hoods, studying their faces with professional interest. Both men were in their 40s, former military based on their posture and scars, the kind of contractors who worked for organizations that needed problems solved quietly. "Now," Dylan continued, "you have a choice. You can maintain your loyalty to employers who sent you on a suicide mission, or you can cooperate with me and federal investigators in exchange for consideration in your sentencing." The larger of the two men finally spoke. "We don't know anything about federal investigations. We were hired to deliver a message." Dylan smiled. "By attempting to murder me? That's an interesting way to communicate." "The message was that you should stop interfering in other people's business." "And who exactly sent this message?" The men exchanged glances, clearly debating how much to reveal. Dylan decided to help them make the decision. "Let me save you some time," he said, pulling out a tablet and showing them photographs of Catherine Reynolds and several associates. "These are the people who hired you. I know their names, their addresses, their financial records, and their operational methods. I know they represent a network of foreign investors who've been using municipal corruption to launder money through real estate development." Both men stared at the photographs in obvious recognition. "What you don't know," Dylan continued, "is that I spent 8 years working for organizations that specialized in dismantling networks exactly like this one. Your employers aren't the first group of criminals I've destroyed, and they won't be the last." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But here's what makes this personal. Your employers got involved in my business because they thought they could protect Trevor Hoffman, the man who was sleeping with my wife. They made my revenge their problem, which means they're now going to experience the full extent of what I'm capable of." One of the contractors, apparently the smarter of the two, seemed to understand the implications. "What do you want from us?" "Everything. Names, addresses, operational procedures, financial arrangements. I want to know how their organization works, who they answer to, and how they've been operating in this city. And if we cooperate, then I'll make sure federal prosecutors know about your cooperation when they're deciding how many years to request at your sentencing. And if we don't," Dylan's expression became glacial, "then you'll discover that there are fates worse than federal prison. Your employers sent you to kill me because they thought I was a threat. They have no idea how right they were." Over the next several hours, Dylan methodically extracted everything the contractors knew about Catherine Reynolds' organization. The picture that emerged was even worse than he'd suspected. a network of foreign nationals using American real estate markets to launder hundreds of millions of dollars, with corruption reaching into state government and federal agencies. By dawn, Dillon had enough information to destroy not just Catherine's immediate organization, but the entire network they represented. He also had 2 federal contractors willing to testify in exchange for reduced sentences and surveillance footage that would make prosecution of the attempted murder case straightforward. As he prepared to contact his federal liaison, Dillon's phone rang with a call from an unknown international number. "Mr. Torres?" The voice was accented, precise, and coldly professional. "I believe you have something that belongs to me. I have 2 employees who failed to complete their assignment," Dillon replied. "If that's what you're referring to. Among other things, I think we should meet and discuss terms for their return. I don't negotiate with people who try to have me killed. Mr. Torres, you have interfered with business arrangements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You have cost us valuable assets and operational security. Surely you understand that such actions require consequences." Dillon's smile was predatory. "Oh, I understand consequences perfectly. Your organization is about to experience a comprehensive education on the subject. I think you misunderstand your position. We know where you live, where you work, who your friends are. We can make your life very unpleasant very quickly." "Actually," Dillon said, looking at the information he'd extracted from the contractors, "I think you misunderstand your position. I now know where all of you live, how your organization operates, and exactly how to dismantle it piece by piece." "Mr. Torres." "No," Dillon interrupted. "Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. You became my enemy when you tried to protect Trevor Hoffman. You escalated to warfare when you sent people to kill me. Now you're going to discover what happens when you threaten someone who's better at this than you are." Dillon ended the call and immediately began implementing Phase 3 of his revenge plan. Catherine Reynolds and her organization had made the mistake of thinking they were dealing with a small-time operator seeking personal revenge. They were about to learn that they declared war on someone who'd been trained to fight much larger battles, and who'd never lost one yet. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. 6 months after the anniversary party that changed everything, Dillon Torres stood in the courtroom as the final sentences were handed down. Trevor Hoffman received 25 years in federal prison. Richard Walsh got 15 years for racketeering and tax evasion. Kevin Walsh received 8 years for securities fraud. Patricia Walsh was sentenced to 5 years for money laundering through her charitable organizations. The federal investigation had expanded far beyond anyone's initial expectations, ultimately bringing down a network of criminals that stretched across 3 states and involved over $200 million in illegal transactions. Catherine Reynolds and her associates had been arrested trying to flee the country, facing charges that would keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. But for Dillon, the legal victories were secondary to the personal satisfaction of watching his enemies realize exactly how thoroughly they'd been destroyed. Brianna sat in the public gallery, a shadow of the woman who'd once thought herself untouchable. Her family's wealth was gone, seized by federal authorities or lost to legal fees. Her social standing had evaporated the moment her affair became public. Her lover was in prison, her family was disgraced, and she was facing her own criminal charges for inadvertently helping to launder money through properties Trevor had purchased for their meetings. As the court session ended, Brianna approached Dillon in the hallway. She looked older, worn down by months of stress and public humiliation. "Are you satisfied now?" she asked quietly. Dillon studied her face, noting the absence of the arrogance that had once defined her. "I'm satisfied that justice has been served." "Justice?" Brianna laughed bitterly. "You destroyed my entire family over an affair. Was your pride really worth all this?" "This was never about pride," Dillon replied. "This was about consequences. You and your family spent years treating me like I was beneath you. You thought you could humiliate me publicly because you believed I was powerless to respond. You were wrong. I made a mistake. One mistake, and you destroyed dozens of lives." Dillon's expression remained impassive. "You made hundreds of mistakes, Brianna. Every lie, every deception, Every moment you looked me in the eye and pretended we had a marriage worth saving. Your family made their own mistakes when they broke federal laws to increase their wealth. Trevor made his mistakes when he chose to prey on married women while running criminal enterprises. Brianna tried one last time to reach the man she'd once married. Dylan, please. I know I hurt you, but this has gone too far. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive me? Can't we try to rebuild something from all this destruction? Dylan looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the woman he'd once loved, but the stranger who betrayed everything he believed in. Some things can't be rebuilt, Brianna. Some betrayals are unforgivable. You wanted to know who you married? Now you know. I'm someone who never forgets, never forgives, and never loses. As he walked away,